This episode of the Tips for Travellers podcast is supported by DK Eyewitness Travel Top 10 Guides, the best-selling pocket-sized travel guidebooks, with top 10 lists covering destination highlights, a pull-out map, things to do, the best places to dine and drink, and more. DK Eyewitness Travel Top 10 Guides show you the 10 best of everything.
This is Tips for Travellers. Inspiration, advice, and tips on finding and having amazing travel experiences on both land and at sea. Get more tips on must-see and must-do travel at tipsfortravellers.com.
Hi and welcome to another episode where we visit another exciting destination in the world. And today we're heading to Nagasaki in Japan. Now, Nagasaki is best known as being the last city that was subject to a nuclear bomb. It happened in August 1945. It happened during World War II when the Americans dropped a bomb on Nagasaki, destroying pretty much all of the city and killing and injuring at least 100,000 people. What few people seem to know is that Nagasaki has a really diverse and very interesting series of stories and history to it, and we'll explore that during the course of the podcast. For example, Pucci set his famous opera Madame Butterfly in Nagasaki, but there is more to the city than just memorials and reminders of the atomic bomb and the Second World War. It's a city that's had very long links with the West, which I'll talk about. Even when Japan was following an isolation policy, it had links to the West, and it's molded and had a huge influence on what Nagasaki became. I found it a very pretty city. I found it an incredibly welcoming city. It had beautiful parks. It had some great historical buildings. It had great museums. And I'm going to explore all of this across the course of the podcast. I really like Nagasaki. Beautiful, fantastic place to visit. Really, really magnificent. So let's, as always, on the podcast, I'll talk a little bit about history, then I'll talk about some key facts, some overall tips, and the must-sees and do's. So let's talk about the history. As I already mentioned in the setup there, it's a city that's got one of the oldest links in Japan to Western Europe. It started right back in the mid-1500s. Portuguese traders and missionaries arrived. It was a tiny little fishing village, and actually the missionaries spent a lot of time converting all of the locals to Christianity. Now, the shogun of the area didn't like this and ended up banning Christianity in 1587 and expelled a lot of the missionaries. However, Christianity still kept going. So 10 years later, as a warning to others, 26 Christians, so 6 missionaries and 20 Japanese, were crucified as a lesson to others, and they became known as the 26 martyrs. And you can visit the site today, and I'll talk about that in the must-see things to do. So the 26 martyrs, you see right back into the 1500s this link to Christianity in the West. Now, what many of you may not know, but there was a long period, about 200 years, where Japan actually self-imposed and isolated itself from the outside world. It basically locked out all contact with the outside world, and it was forbidden. And so the Portuguese were driven out around this time, but eventually slowly there was little chinks in that, and an exception was made for Dutch traders. Now, they were allowed to operate in Nagasaki Bay on Dejima Island. So technically it wasn't on mainland Japan, and there was a little sort of a bit of a fudge, I guess. So the Dutch traders were allowed to operate on Dejima Island. Now, depending on which history books you read, it was thought that for a very long time Nagasaki was the only port that traded with foreigners. There's some dispute about that. There's the sense that many historians believe there were some other ports doing Western trade. However, Nagasaki is generally accepted as being the only place, or the main place certainly, that trade was done with the West. Nagasaki boomed after the end of the isolation because it has a really important port. It became a free port in 1859. And it became a really important port. It became a big center for shipbuilding led by the Mitsubishi Company. And Mitsubishi Company became the main contractor for the Japanese Navy. So you can see, of course, the beginnings of why it became a target in the Second World War. During, up to the Second World War and during the Second World War, Nagasaki and the area produced a lot of steel-related products, a lot through Mitsubishi companies. So they made engines, they made weapons, and of course, not surprisingly, during the war, it became target for some bombing raids, smaller raids. However, everything changed significantly when on the 9th of August 1945, the Americans dropped a nuclear bomb. It was dropped at 11:20 a.m. The nuclear bomb was nicknamed Fat Man, and it was the second city after Hiroshima. Now, the population at the time was estimated to be about 250,000. But what was interesting about Nagasaki, and those of you who study history will know the name Nagasaki, Nagasaki was actually not the original target for this bomb. The original target was a place called Kokura. It was some distance away, but on the day they found that the bombers found it very difficult to find because there was lots of fires and lots of smoke, and it actually, ironically, there'd been bombing raids the night before. So the original target of Kokura was, they just couldn't see it. So as fuel started to run low, they changed the target to a fallback, which was Nagasaki. Now, they were supposed to have really bombed the shipbuilding area, but again, poor visibility meant that they used something else. I think believe they used the racecourse as sort of the target. Dropped the bomb, it exploded 500 meters above the main part of the city. 40% of the city was destroyed. It's not 100% sure how many died because no one knows exactly what the population was, but it was projected to be between 40 and 80,000, half immediately, the other half suffering sort of very painful effects and dying later from all the radiation. The city was rebuilt, initially focused very much, as you would expect, on the industry. Industry was very important, the port is very important, and it's become a very important port and a very important shipbuilding centre again. So it builds cruise ships and all different types of ships there. So very significantly important city. So let me give you some key facts you need to know about Nagasaki. It's on Kyushu, which is Japan's third largest and the most southern of the four main islands. I've said it many, many times. It's a port city. It's got a very good natural harbour, the best on the island, which is why it became so important. Main industries: fishing, shipbuilding, and tourism. And there's lots to do in Nagasaki. If you're trying to get a sense of where Nagasaki is, it's about the same latitude as Tel Aviv, San Diego, so it's in the northern hemisphere. The other thing with Nagasaki is you've got the port and you've got these hills all around the side. So actually when the bomb was dropped, it kind of was contained in this sort of like bowl, if you like. So that caused a lot of damage. If it had been on a flat, the effects would have spread out much more. So it was much more concentrated. So overall, what did I think of it? I've said it already. It's a very pretty city. It's got a gorgeous harbour, beautiful bay, and it's actually hard now to imagine it being devastated by the war. There's these magnificent hills. You get beautiful views up from Mount Inasa. Very welcoming, very friendly. They have things like special call lines with multilingual help, for tourists. They have a great tourist map, and I'll put some links certainly, and I'll talk about some of those things when I talk about my general tips, and I'll put links in the show notes of things that they have. But very welcoming, very supportive of tourists. There's lots of things to do. Obviously, there's important to do things, I believe, linked to the nuclear bomb, but then you can step back and you can look pre-war, post-war. There's some really interesting stories and things to see in Nagasaki. So let's talk about general sort of information. So the best time to go, well, it has relatively mild winters. The coldest month is January, around 7 degrees. It's got hot summers because it's the northern hemisphere, like most places. August is the hottest, average around 28. So a lot of people would argue that sort of spring, early summer, autumn's a great time to go. If you want to get there, the nearest airport is Nagasaki Airport. It's actually close by the city of Omura. It's also becoming, but Nagasaki you can fly into, and lots of connections, particularly within Japan. It's also becoming a popular cruise ship stop. It's got a very modern cruise terminal right in the city centre, why it's so popular, because it's right there in the city centre. It's within walking distance of places like Glover Garden, which I talk about. It's handy for the trams. The tram system's great for getting around. So it's becoming very accessible. Plus, of course, you've got the train system in and out as well. It's a large city. It's a hilly city. And getting around is more of a challenge, though, because the attractions that you're going to want to see are quite a distance apart. So, managing your way around sightseeing, you need to be a little bit more organized. So you can either go on a tour, of course, or you could use taxis. And what's important is make sure you've got the name of where you want to go written in Japanese, because it's unlikely that your drivers will speak English. So make sure you've got the names in Japanese. Either get someone to write them for you, or if you've got your smartphone, There's some Wi-Fi around the city that you can use, or maybe just print them out or something before you go the places you want to go, so that you've got the names in Japanese. But also the tram and the streetcar system is pretty good. The great thing about the tram and streetcar system is it's quite easy to use as a tourist, because the names of the stops are based on the nearest attraction or site, although you might have to walk a little bit. But when you look at the map, if you're saying I want to go to a certain place, the stop is basically named after whatever the nearest attraction is to it. There's 4 lines. There's a blue line, which is number 1, red line number 3, yellow number 4, and number 5 is green. There's no line number 2. The way they work is you enter through the rear door, and you just basically press the bell for the stop you want, and you pay the driver on exiting. But you can buy day passes at things like the cruise terminal or information centres or most hotels, which is easier. So actually having a day pass is much easier. The buses are more difficult to use than the trams, because they're all in Japanese. They're much, much harder to use. So I would actually recommend avoiding the bus system. The other thing I would strongly recommend is make sure you pick up the map, the tourist map, either at the tourist office, your hotel, or if you're coming on a cruise ship from the cruise guide. It's called the Nagasaki map. Welcome to Nagasaki. And they have them in different languages. Obviously, if it's English, you pick it up in English. Really good map. It gives you all the tram lines. It gives you all the things you want to see. It gives you little write-ups about the places. So it'll have, for all the places you want to go, it's going to have a little write-up about it as well. And it also gives you all instructions on, how to find your way around. It's a really good map. So that's a pretty important thing to do. Japan drives on the left, so if you're hiring a car, take that into account. So if you're coming from somewhere like the UK, it's very easy, but if you're coming from Europe or the US, they drive on the opposite side to you're used to. Important, you must have Japanese yen. That's the only currency that's taken, and it's expensive. Japan is expensive. Watch out, you're not allowed to smoke or litter in public spaces. They're very strict about that. Walking and eating and drinking is frowned upon. It's a good idea also to take toilet paper and hand wash with you, and expect a wide variety of toilets. You get lots of the modern toilets, and you also get the hole in the floor ones. Great thing about Japan, and in the other podcasts I've done about Japan, is public toilets are all over the place, and they're very clean and very accessible, which is great. So let me talk about some overall tips for travelers before I get into the must see and must do. So what I would actually recommend is, before you go, obviously listen to the podcast that's giving you some tips, but I would also make sure that you access and take some of the details of the great help that the Nagasaki Tourism Board has arranged for tourists. So you've got the official Nagasaki tourism site, which is fantastic. They have lots of information. They have tram maps, and they have links to all the different types of tourist support. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes. But it's www.at-nagasaki.jp/foreign/English. So you'll see why I say it's probably easy to put a link into the show notes. But of course, if you just search, Nagasaki Tourist Information Site or Nagasaki Tourism Board, something like that, you'll obviously find it. But I would strongly recommend you go there, have a look at it, get things at the tram maps. But of course, you can go to the tourist information centres themselves, or pick up at like the airport or hotels the actual map as well, which has all this information in. The other thing I would recommend is take the information for the Nagasaki City Call Centre. This is a great innovation. It's available in English, Chinese and Korean, and it's open 365 days a year from 8 o'clock in the morning to 8 o'clock at night. And you basically phone a telephone number 095 825 5175. You won't remember that, it'll be in the show notes, but also it'll be on the map, etc. And they will help you out in either English, Chinese or Korean. So it's a great service. So you can just phone that number and get as much help as you want. They also have, and you'll see it on the tourism site, a discount card, which can be valid for 3 days, and it has discounts to all the attractions. Again, there's a link on the main site, the main Nagasaki site, travel.at-nagasaki.jp, and I'll put a link in the show notes as well. But they have a great PDF which has all the discounts. So all of the places you're going to want to go to see, the tourism site will give you discounts to. So make sure that you download that. And again, I'll put the website and all that link. Free Wi-Fi is available in various parts of the city, especially at bus and cruise terminal. It's not everywhere. It's not sort of citywide, but there's good Wi-Fi bits here and there. People aren't going to speak a lot of English, so it's quite nice to learn a few key words like good day, konnichiwa, goodbye, sayonara, thank you, arigato, please, kudasai, kudasai. And, just having a couple of keywords, it's greatly appreciated. But the Japanese people are so welcoming, so friendly, and they will go out of their way to try and help you. I already mentioned some of the etiquette tips. Don't throw rubbish around. Don't eat and drink while walking. And, the stuff about toilets I've already spoken about. So let's get into the must-see and must-do things. Now, what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to start off a little bit talking about stuff related to the atomic bomb, because it's really fundamental and important to the story of Nagasaki. But then I'll move beyond that and talk about some of the really fabulous and very exciting and very beautiful things to also see as well. So Nagasaki is really nice because it's got a really, really good mix. So let's talk first of all about the Peace Park and the Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Museum. So let me talk about the museum first, and then I'll talk about the Peace Park, because actually going to the museum first and the Peace Park second is maybe a really interesting way of doing it, because the Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Museum is quite sobering, and the Peace Park is very beautifully done, and it's a really nice anecdote or contrast to it. So again, I will put the website link in the show notes, but it's nagasakipeace.jp is the website, and it's a very modern looking building. You walk into the building and then you go down this sort of circular walkway down into sort of the bowels of the building, and then in the bowels of the building is three sort of halls and areas of focus, which I'll talk about in a second. One of the most noticeable things is when you come in to the entrance, though, you will see many of these 1,000 craned garland, which school trips or countries or various groups have left. And basically what happened is there was a girl from Hiroshima, a young girl who had been affected by radiation, had leukemia, and was basically diagnosed to die. And she believed that if she made 1,000 origami cranes, the bird cranes, that she would survive. However, she died before she made 1,000. So this has become a symbol of peace and like a symbol of the whole story of the atomic bomb, and it's like a gesture. So in the hallway you'll see these very beautiful origami garlands, absolutely magnificent. You can't buy them, they're just there, but they're very moving and very, very, very beautiful indeed. But an absolute must do. So if you go into the museum, watch out, there are some very graphic photographs. There are some very poignant items, mangled spectacles, some pictures of the effects of people, and they can be quite upsetting. There's some reconstruction of the city, and it can be quite moving, but I think it's an important thing to do. So, as I said, there's three sort of areas to it. The first area, it really is around August the 9th, 1945, where they basically see scenery of the area before the bombing as you come into the museum. So lots of photos of the district and basically before the bombing. And there's a film of the cloud actually taken at the time of the viewing, and a clock that stopped at 11:02, which is the time of the explosion. And this clock was found in a house near the Sano Shrine. It was about 800 meters away from the hypercenter, and that's quite a sort of poignant thing. Then you go through into another hall, which is around, and it's focused on damage caused by the atomic bomb. So it kind of reproduces some of the things that happened. So you'll have, for example, there's a water tank from the Kiho Middle School with all the contorted legs. And again, that was about 800 meters away from the hypercenter. You see some things ruined from the Urakami Cathedral, some rosaries. The people died, but some of the rosaries were recovered. You'll see a depiction of the whole process of a bomb. You'll also see a life-size model of Fat Man, the bomb that was dropped. and you'll see some leaflets that were dropped, and there's a map, a sort of a model, not a map, a model showing the Nagasaki, and then showing how the fireball went, the heat rays, the blast, etc. And also in here you'll find a whole lot of other things. So you'll find some damaged things like some damaged lunch boxes, some bottles that have melted together, some clothing, and this is clothing that was from like 1.2 kilometers away at the Nagasaki Steelworks, some helmet with remains of a skull inside, and a rather surreal thing, which is a building with a silhouette of a man and ladder. So they were basically, as I understand it, kind of vaporized, but as it was burnt, you've got this shadow left, so it's slightly eerie. So those kind of things, as you can see, they are a little bit disturbing and traumatic. So you'll have lots of that kind of stuff there. Then in another area, which is quite a large area, it's sort of looking forward. So, and this hall is called Toward a World Free of Nuclear Weapons, and it talks about the history of the nuclear weapon development, what happened post the war. It talks about modern weapons. It talks about the nuclear age and that kind of stuff. So, really, really interesting, little bit sobering, but very, very important. And it's a very beautiful museum. As I mentioned, you've got there's this glass dome, and then you walk round down into the sort of the bowels of it, where you have that hallway. Now, just next to the Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Museum is the Nagasaki National Peace Memorial Hall for atomic bomb victims. So it's just sort of above the museum. So the main entrance to the museum sort of face that one way. You actually sort of have to go round behind the museum. And there's another very beautiful memorial hall, which is quite a modern-looking building, and it's a very pretty thing. It's quite restful. So you've got this remembrance hall where they encourage people to pray for peace, and it's got the names of the victims, and you've got a library there. It's a very beautiful building with glass pillars, very, very moving. So that's definitely something worth going to. There's some water there as well, like a pond. It's very beautiful, very restful. So, and that's something worth going to. A lot of people, I think, don't realize, because it's sort of just behind the museum. Now, if you're coming on a coach, for example, perhaps on a tour, it's sort of where the coaches park, so you could have end up walking past it to go to the museum. But I would strongly recommend going to there as well. And the website for that is, and I'll get up in the show notes, is peace-nagasaki.go.jp. But definitely a really important thing to do and go and see. So once you've done that, and as I said, that can be a little bit traumatic, the thing to then do is the Peace Park. Now, the Peace Park is it's very peaceful. It's very impressive. It's a big garden. There's a key statue here. It's a big 30-foot high statue of a man. He's got one arm up, signifying the threat of nuclear weapons, and another outstretched arm symbolizing eternal peace. And it's a beautiful, beautiful piece of sculpture, and it kind of dominates the top of the Peace Park. But then as you walk around the Peace Park, there's lots of other statues which are around peace and hope. What I find quite interesting is when you look at the dates of the various statues, many of them were by kind of anti-American or even communist countries. So that's where they started. But as time's gone on, it's become a little bit more diverse. You've got, for example, some of the more recent ones are from New Zealand. There's none from the United States. There's also a very beautiful fountain here, which is in the shape of wings, and it's also quite moving because the way they've done it, I think there's often a little rainbow on it. But the Peace Park is absolutely gorgeous. It's just north of the museum, so it's just absolutely magnificent. That 30-foot high statue is just stunning, and it was built in 1955. Great, it's really, really quite impressive. The other thing that you can also do just near to the museum is you can walk down to the sort of the ground zero point, which is where the epicenter of the bomb was. As I said, the bomb was exploded about 500 meters above, and there's like a plinth which is right above the spot, and then there's sort of marble casket, I guess, in front of it where they put the names of the people. There's a beautiful statue, and there's a ruin of part of a church there, and that's also it's a very moving part. But the Peace Park is gorgeous. It's really, really, really quite something. As you sort of then get out and look at other things, there's the one-legged torii gate. So basically, the torii gates are the thing that normally in front of the shrine. It's a very distinctive thing, and there's only got one side of it. And it's not very easy to get to, but often if you move around the city or if you're on a tour, you drive past it. But they left that there as a sort of symbol. Another great thing to do is once you've done that is now I'd recommend to enjoy the beauty of Nagasaki. And one of the things I would strongly recommend is going up Mount Inasa. The Mount Inasa lookout, it's 1,093 feet above sea level. You get stunning views over the city. You go up in a cable car. Now they actually call it in Japan a ropeway. And you head up the cable car. There's a great lookout building where you have a 360-degree panoramic view. You can see the city. Now, what they actually recommend is go at night, because at night it's magical when it's all lit up across the hills. I only went during the day, and that was pretty impressive. But there's a restaurant up there. There's a fabulous. It's really well done. The website is nagasaki-ropeway.jp. Really, really strongly recommend going up the cable car. It's only a 5-minute ride up to the top. There's a little walk at the top, but it's really absolutely strongly recommend you do Mount Inasa. People who went to Nagasaki and didn't do it, I think, really missed out on something. The sort of the group that we were within. So the other thing that I would strongly recommend you then do is Glover Garden. This is fascinating. Now, Glover originated from Scotland, and he is credited with bringing lots of modern ideas and development to Japan. He's very fondly thought of by the people of the city. He brought things like the railway. He started shipbuilding. He was really responsible for the origins of the Mitsubishi Corporation, even Kirin Beer. It's situated on the sort of southern slope, the bottom slope of one of the mountains, so you get a great view of the harbour as well. So if you don't go all the way up the ropeway up, Mount Inasa, Glover Garden also gives you a great view. And what you have in the gardens is the original Glover residence. And then you basically have 6 other Western-style residences from all across sort of the decades that have been dismantled and moved and put here, so you can get some really important things. It's a really beautiful garden, and I'm just going to take a look at the brochure to remind myself about some of the things that you see in there. So sorry, you probably hear the sound there. So altogether there is 10 sort of sites, 10 key things to do. Buildings there. So you've got the Glover House, which is the old and Western style wooden building in Japan. It was built in 1863. It's really, really interesting, and you still have some of their artifacts in there. But other things you've got there, for example, you've got the former Mitsubishi No. 2 dockhouse, which is where ship crews would rest while their ship was in the shipyard for repairs. Again, it dates back from 1896. You've got the front gatehouse of the former Nagasaki Commercial College there. Another great one is the former Walker House, which was the residence of a British businessman, Robert Neil Walker's second son. And it's an interesting mix because it's kind of Western, but it's got a Japanese roof. You've got the former Alt residence, which is the largest stone-built Western-style house remaining in Nagasaki. It was built by Komiya Hide, who originally worked on the Glover residence. And you've got all these kind of interesting buildings there. You've also got statues of Pucci and Tamaki Mura, who was who the Madame Butterfly, who became famous for playing Madame Butterfly, and just lots and lots of great things. You can also have a retro photography studio where you can dress up. There's a great shop. It's just really beautiful. It's a beautiful, beautiful garden. It's often full of school trips and young people, and it's got a really great view. It's a really sort of vibrant part of the city where people just go and they hang out and walk around, and it's got a really great atmosphere there. I'd strongly recommend that. A couple of other key things is the Oyura Catholic Church, which is the oldest wooden Christian church in Japan. It's just next to the Glover Garden, so it's quite handy. It was built in 1865. under supervision of a French missionary, and it was built in memory of those 26 crucified Christian martyrs I spoke about. It's got very beautiful stained glass. It's got beautiful views from the gardens. It's a great thing to do, and it's another very, very, very popular place to go. The other thing which is very popular to go to, and it links back to what I was talking about in the history, is Dejima. Now, if you remember, when I was talking about that isolation policy from sort of the 1600s to the mid 1800s, when the Dutch were the only Westerners allowed sort of into the country, and they had that trading centre, it was this man-made island, Dejima, in the harbour. Now, actually, what they've now been doing recently is they've now renovated and restored it. So now you can actually go and take a look at what it was like. So they've got a museum, and it shows how the Dutch lived and traded. And again, like I said, it's very easy to find these things because the tram stop is called the Dejima tram stop. As remember I mentioned, all of these stops are pretty much the same name as the local attraction. Now, I've mentioned it a couple of times, but the 26 Martyrs Memorial is something I'd also strongly recommend because it's so important to the story of Nagasaki. So remember I said Christianity was banned in the late 1500s, and the 26 Christian martyrs were crucified. And they were crucified on Niziaka Hill. And it's now pretty central in Nagasaki. And Pope Pius IX, he canonized them in the 1800s. And there's a monument and a museum. It's about a 5-minute walk from the Nagasaki station. But there's a really interesting museum because it tells the history of Christianity in Japan. And so that makes it pretty interesting indeed. There are a few other things. So there's like a couple of temples. There's the Sofukuji Temple, which is Nagasaki's most famous temple. It was built in 1629. It was supervised by a monk of the Ming dynasty. It was designed for the city's Chinese residents. It's got this beautiful red-painted Buddha hall. It's got a beautiful gate. Both of them are designated as national treasure. There's a huge cauldron in it as well, which used to feed the population during famine in the 1600s. Very fascinating to visit. So that's the Sofukuji Temple. Then there's another temple, which is the Kofukuji Temple, which is a Zen Buddhist temple. It's only 9 years older than the other one, and this is where prayers were held here for Chinese residents, traveling to and from China. It's a beautiful temple. So if you want to go and see temples, there's the Sofukuji Temple and the Kofuji Temple. Really strongly recommended. So hopefully that's given you a good sense of Nagasaki. So there's a very interesting mix of the story of the atomic bomb and the optimistic side with the Peace Park and the beautiful statues, which are fascinating to stroll around. But then you do have lots of other interesting things. The Glover Garden is fantastic, and Mount Inisa is fantastic, and a lot of things to see and do. So Nagasaki, I loved it. It's a beautiful city, really welcoming, really friendly. Loved it a lot. And if you go to Japan, I would definitely put it on a list of places to go and see. So that's giving you lots of ideas, tips, inspiration, advice, and more. Remember, if you're listening to this for the first time, I'd love it if you subscribed and get all future episodes downloaded automatically. If you're a regular listener, I'd love it if you left a rating and a review to give me feedback, which is really helpful, but also it does mean that the podcast shows up even better in things like iTunes and helps more people find it. And of course, more people find it, even better for me in terms of getting the message out there. If you want to do that, the easiest way to do is obviously you can go to your favorite podcast catcher and just search Tips for Travelers. But the other thing to do is use these shortcodes, which will take you straight to the page. So you type in tipsfortravelers.com, travelers spelled with 2 L's, and then /iTunes TFT. TFT standing for Tips for Travelers. So iTunes TFT, obviously to iTunes, Stitcher TFT, Stitcher, TuneIn TFT, TuneIn, or a Google Play TFT. So thanks if you do that. I really appreciate it if you do that. So until next time, hope you've enjoyed this podcast, and here's to happy, safe, and wonderful travels.